Beyond the Occult by Colin Wilson. Chapter 1, Mediums and Mystics. In 1964, an experimental psychologist named Lawrence LeSean became increasingly interested in the way the mind can influence the body, and decided with some misgivings to study the evidence for extrasensory perception. This was out of sheer conscientiousness, for his training as a scientist had convinced him that it could not exist. I was fairly sure that I would wind up trying to figure out how it was that serious men like William James, Gardner Murphy, and a half-dozen Nobel Prize winners had been deluded into believing such nonsense. Careful study changed his mind. To my intense surprise, as I began to read the scientific journals and serious books in the field, it became obvious that the material was valid. The standards of research were extremely high, and the evidence scientifically valid. The only alternative explanation to the hundreds of carefully studied spontaneous incidents reported and the hundreds of scientifically controlled laboratory experiments was that the greatest conspiracy in history had been going on for more than 80 years. LeSean heard that a medium named Eileen Garrett was highly regarded in scientific circles and decided to work with her. His first professional encounter convinced him that she was no fraud. Previous researchers had been trying to get Mrs. Garrett to guess the color of cardboard squares. That sounded dreary. So LeSean decided to try to make it more interesting. He clipped a lock of hair from the head of his 12-year-old daughter, Wendy, persuaded the next-door neighbor to give him a tuft of hair from the tail of their dog, and plucked a fresh rosebud from the garden. These were placed in 3 plastic boxes, and LeSean began the experiment by telling the medium what was in each of them. Then he retreated behind a scene with the boxes, and Mrs. Garrett had to put her arm in through a narrow hole. LeSean took a box at random and placed it where she could touch it. She immediately identified it correctly as the box containing the lock of his daughter's hair, then went on to make incredibly accurate comments about the child. Her first remark was, "I think I'll call her Hillary. She'll like that." In fact, when Wendy LeSean was 4 years old, she had developed a crush on a girl named Hillary, and had begged her parents to let her change her name to Hillary. But the incident was long forgotten, and it had not even been mentioned in the family for years. Mrs. Garrett then went on to make a series of weirdly accurate comments on Wendy. For example, that she loved horses, she recently developed an unexpected interest in American history. Her insights into the dog were equally impressive, particularly since LeSean knew nothing about dogs and the neighbors had only just moved in. Mrs. Garrett announced that the dog had a severe pain in its paw and that it seemed to have a cilium companion. The neighbors verified that the animal had cut its paw so badly that it turned septic and necessitated a 6-week stay in hospital, and that although a purebred Welsh Terrier, something about its bone structure made dog fanciers ask whether it had a touch of cilium. LeSean did not even know what a cilium was. As to the rose, Mrs. Garrett commented that the soil was too acid for it to grow well, something LeSean had been told by expert gardeners. But perhaps his most impressive encounter with Eileen Garrett concerned a missing doctor. The man had gone to a medical conference in a distant town and failed to return home. Knowing that he was working with Mrs. Garrett, the doctor's wife sent LeSean a 2-inch square from the T-shirt the doctor had been wearing the day before he had vanished. When LeSean visited the medium, he said nothing about the missing doctor, but when she was in a trance, he placed the cloth in her fingers and told her that the man to whom it belonged had disappeared. Mrs. Garrett replied, "He is in La Jolla, California. He went there due to a psychic wound he suffered when he was 14 years old and his father disappeared." That evening LeSean telephoned the wife, who lived 1,000 miles away, and asked her if anything happened to her husband between the ages of 13 and 15. She replied that his father had deserted the family when he was 14 and returned home 25 years later. In due course, the doctor reappeared of his own accord and verified that he had gone, or had indeed, been in La Jolla. The more LeSean investigated mediums, the more he became convinced that they see the world from a viewpoint that differs completely from that of the ordinary person. It is as if they can put themselves into states of mind in which they cease to be subject to the ordinary limitations of space and time. LeSean cites a case involving Mrs. Margaret Verrall, the wife of the Cambridge Don, who was one of the most remarkable mediums in the early decades of the 20th century. When practicing automatic writing, Mrs. Verrall recorded the following scene. The cold was intense, and a single candle gave poor light. He was lying on the sofa, or on a bed, and he was reading. Marmontel, by the light of a single candle. He was reading Marmontel by the light of a single candle. The book was lent to him. It did not belong to him. In a script, a few days later, she wrote, "Marmontel is right. It is a French book, a memoir, I think. Passy may help, Souvenirs de Passy or Fleury." The book was bound and was lent, 2 volumes in old-fashioned binding and print. Some time later she met a friend, a Mr. Marsh, who told her that she accurately described something that had happened to him. He had borrowed 1 volume of Marmontel's memoirs from the London Library and taken it to Paris, where he had read it in bed on a freezing cold night by the light of a single candle. The chapter he had been reading was about the discovery of a picture painted at Passy and associated with a certain M. de Fleury. An interesting piece of clairvoyance, one might think, but not particularly remarkable, until we learn that Mrs. Varell wrote her description on December 11th, 1911, and Mr. Marsh did not read the book in Paris until February 21st of the following year. Mrs. Varell had accurately foreseen something that would not happen for more than 2 months, but then the episode of the vanishing doctor seems to carry the same implications. The doctor's wife sent a shirt he had worn on the day before he went off to the conference, and all the evidence indicates that the doctor vanished on a sudden impulse several days later. How could the shirt afford Mrs. Garrett a clue to something that was to happen in the future? LeSean decided that the best way of finding out was to ask her, in fact, to ask all of the sensitives. He could find what it felt like to know something that it was illogically impossible to know. When I approached them with this question, something fascinating immediately happened. "Oh yes," they said, "when we are getting the paranormal information, the world looks different than at other times." "Different?" I asked, as this clearly seemed very important. "Different how?" Mrs. Garrett explained that she somehow shifted her whole field of awareness, and that this involved a kind of turning inward. She did this, she said, by a sort of self-hypnosis. Asked what she meant by this, she explained, "It is a withdrawal from the conscious self into an area of the non-conscious self. And within this other mind, life is being worked out on a different level." She described the sensation as being like living in 2 worlds at once, and she emphasized that her glimpses were not something she achieved with conscious effort, they just happened. You open a door for a moment and are confronted with it. The door closes as it opened, and the image is gone. LeSean was struck by the close similarity between what Mrs. Garrett told him and various mystics' descriptions of their sudden illuminations. Here, for example, is a well-known description of an illumination experienced by a modern writer, Warner Allen. "It flashed up lightning-wise during a performance of Beethoven's 7th Symphony at the Queen's Hall. In that triumphant fast movement, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The swift flowing continuity of the music was not interrupted, so that what Mr. T.S. Eliot calls the intersection of the timeless moment must have been slipped into the interval between 2 demi-semi-quavers. When long after I analyzed the happening in the cold light of retrospect, it seemed to fall into 3 parts. First, the mysterious event itself, which occurred in an infinitesimal fraction of a split second. This I learned afterwards from Santa Teresa to call the union with God the illumination, a wordless stream of complex feelings in which the experience of union combined with the rhythmic emotion of the music, like a sunbeam striking with iridescence the spray above a waterfall, a stream that was continually swollen by tributaries of associated experience. Lastly, enlightenment, the recollection in tranquility of the whole complex field of experience, as it were embalmed in thought form and words. Here again we have the opening of a door and a sudden brief glimpse, the comparison of many such illuminations with the descriptions of psychics like Eileen Garrett, Rosalind Haywood, and Phoebe Payne, finally convinced LeSean that both the medium and the mystic experience the same abrupt shift of viewpoint, so they find themselves looking into another world. It might be compared to a man sitting in a boat looking at the surface of the ocean who suddenly plunges his head beneath the surface and sees an entirely new world down below. And for some odd reason beyond our understanding, this paranormal world below the sea is timeless, so that the events in the future or in the past can be studied just as easily as the present. This is one of the most basic statements of all the mystics, that time is somehow an illusion. And this, LeSean thought, must be the ultimate solution, the only solution, to the mystery of precognition. Of course, the statement that time is unreal strikes most of us as nonsense. The philosopher G.E. Moore thought he had disproved it by pulling out his watch. Yet, if there were really people who can foresee the future then our common sense view of time as a one-way street must somehow be wrong. LeSean first outlined these ideas about mystics and mediums in a small book called Towards a General Theory of the Paranormal, 1969. And when he presented me with a copy in the early 1970s, I was immediately struck by the similarity of these views to a theory I had put forward in The Occult, that poets seem to be natural psychics. I had cited a number of cases, some of them gathered at first hand, of poets who had experiences of second sight or precognition. The poet and historian A.L. Rouse had described how he was leaning out of an old-fashioned Victorian window at Christ Church when it entered his head. Suppose the thing should fall. Being in a black mood, he said to himself, "Let the damn thing fall." As he withdrew his head a moment later, the sash window fell with a crash that would probably have broken his neck if he had still been leaning out. I theorize that the poet is a person who has the power to sink into moods of reflective calm, in which he withdraws into himself. And in such moods he becomes aware of the voice of the unconscious mind. Or, as LeSean expresses it, the sensitive opens a channel of communication to some part of his non-conscious self, which normally operates in this way. LeSean was also willing to entertain a notion first put forward by the psychical researcher Frederick Myers in the 1880s, that the part of the non-conscious self which has paranormal powers is not the unconscious mind as described by Freud, a kind of dark basement full of guilts and repressions, but some kind of superconscious mind, a kind of attic as much above everyday awareness as the subconscious basement is below it. And this was also the view held by Mrs. Garrett. There are certain concentrations of consciousness in which awareness is withdrawn as far as possible from the impact of all sensory perceptions. Such withdrawals of consciousness from the outer world are common to all of us in some measure. What happens to us at these times is that as we withdraw from the environing world, we relegate the activities of the five senses to the field of the subconscious, and seek to focus awareness, to the best of our ability, in the field of the superconscious, the timeless, spaceless field of the as yet unknown. Most of us, as Mrs. Garrett remarks, have some experience of this kind of thing. For example, we can occasionally become so deeply absorbed in a book that if someone slams a door, it almost gives us a heart attack. We also slip into that same world of deep absorption on the edge of asleep, a subject that will be explored in Chapter 5. But these excursions are usually brief. We either fall asleep or quickly return to the normal world. What Mrs. Garrett seems to be investigating is that the psychic has the power to change her viewpoint, so as to slip into this state at will. But once it has been attained, she has no further power. The will goes to sleep. It is no use trying to obtain results. They can only be obtained by not trying. Eileen Garrett remarked, "I knew from experience that conscious effort was the only thing which would produce no results that could be described as supernormal." In an essay called Mysticism and Logic, Bertrand Russell asserts that all mystics seem to agree on 4 basic points. 1, that there is a better way of knowing than through the senses. 2, that there is a fundamental unity or oneness in the universe. 3, that time is an illusion. 4, that evil is a mere appearance. Russell considers these statements and ends by dismissing them as nonsense. His own final conclusion being that scientific philosophy comes nearer to objectivity than the other human pursuit. Most normal people will be inclined to agree with him. Yet as soon as we begin to study accounts of mystical experience, one thing becomes very clear, that they are all talking about exactly the same thing. What follows are a few typical accounts taken from Nona Coxhead's The Relevance of Bliss. The first is a description by a medical journalist, Wendy Rose Neal. I had always found gardening a relaxing activity, and on this particular day I felt in a very contemplative frame of mind. I remember that I gradually became intensely aware of my surroundings. The sound of the birds singing, the rustling of leaves, the breeze on my skin, and the scent of the grass and the flowers. I had a sudden impulse to lie face down on the grass, and as I did, an energy seemed to flow through me as if I had become part of the earth underneath me. The boundary between my physical self and my surroundings seemed to dissolve, and my feelings of separation vanished. In a strange way, I felt blended into a total unity with the earth, as if I were made of it and it of me. I was aware of the blades of grass between my fingers and touching my face, and I was overwhelmed by a force which seemed to penetrate every fiber of my being. I felt as if I had suddenly come alive for the first time, as if I were awakening from a long, deep sleep into the real world. I realized that I was surrounded by an incredible loving energy, and that everything, both living and non-living, is bound inextricably with a kind of consciousness, which I cannot describe in words. Here is an account by an American authoress, Claire Myers Owen. One morning I was writing at my desk in the quiet writing room of our house in Connecticut. Suddenly everything within my sight vanished right away. No longer did I see my body, the furniture in the room, the white rain slanting across the windows. No longer was I aware of where I was, the day or hour. Time and space ceased to exist. Suddenly the entire room was filled with a great golden light. The whole world was filled with nothing but light. Extraordinary intuitive insights flashed across my mind. I seemed to comprehend the nature of things. I understood that the scheme of the universe was good, not evil, as our Western society had taught me as a child. All people were intrinsically good. Neither time nor space existed on this plane. This flood of light is a common feature of mystical experiences. In one of the most famous of all books on mysticism, Richard Maurice Buck described his own experience as he was driving home in a hansom cab. All at once, without warning of any kind, I found myself wrapped in a flame-colored cloud. For an instant, I thought of fire, an immense conflagration somewhere close by. The next, I knew that the fire was within myself. Directly afterwards, there came upon me a sense of exaltation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination, impossible to describe. Among other things, I saw that the universe is not composed of dead matter, but is, on the contrary, a living presence. I became conscious in myself of eternal life. It was not a conviction that I would have eternal life, but a consciousness that I possessed eternal life then. I saw that all men are immortal. The vision lasted a few seconds and was gone. Buck labeled the glimpse Cosmic Consciousness and gave his book the same title. It consists of 50 studies of mystics who have experienced cosmic consciousness, beginning with the Buddha and ending with the Victorian Edward Carpenter. Buck jumped to the conclusion that such an experience is rare, and that since there are increasing number of modern examples, mankind is probably evolving to a higher level of awareness. In fact, modern surveys, such as those taken by Sir Alister Hardy's Religious Research Unit in Oxford, show that an incredible 36% of people have had some kind of religious or mystical experience. Another basic element in accounts of mystical experience is that the feeling that the light or power comes from within. Moose Murray's account of his illumination in Cyprus contains the phrase, an indescribable sensation, as if the whole universe was being poured through into me, or rather more as if the whole universe was welling out of me from some deep center. One of Nona Coxhead's correspondents, Jim Harrison, told her how he had been wondering how God could permit his wife to remain ill when it struck him. Maybe it wasn't God's fault after all. So then I thought, all right, I take it all back, and filling my heart with a tender love often reserved for my little daughter, I projected it towards him, thinking, if you exist, then I give you my love. I could feel this love being passed on, and then suddenly it returned, a brilliant shaft of light from out of the sky, brighter by far than the mid-morning sun, permeating me with such an intensity of happiness and love as to halt me in my tracks with a jump for joy and lingering for 5 or 10 seconds before fading away. I knew intuitively that this light, plainly visible, somehow mysteriously stemmed from within. Jim Harrison, like so many others who had experienced a flash of cosmic consciousness, concluded, so then I knew for certain that God does indeed exist. that he is love, that he is joy, that he is light, that he stems from within as much as from without, and that we are alone, and that we alone are responsible for our sufferings and problems and consequence of the misuse of our free will. C.G. Price, a farmer whose farm was on the point of bankruptcy, had a similar experience of light. With thoughts of self-pity, such as these in mind, one Sunday morning in February 1968, I set about the task of bedding my cows down with straw. I don't even remember the feeling creeping up on me, but suddenly I seemed to be helped in a cocoon of golden light that actually felt warm, and which radiated a feeling of love so intense that it was almost tangible. One felt that one could grasp handfuls of it and fill one's pockets. In this warm cocoon of golden light I sensed a presence, which I could not exactly see, but knew was there. My mind became crystal clear, and in an instant of time I suddenly knew, without any doubts, that I was part of a whole. Not an isolated part, but an integral part. I felt a sense of one-ment. I knew that I belonged, and that nothing could change that. The loss of my farm and livelihood didn't matter anymore. In fact, he was forced to sell the farm, but his mystical experience made this seem unimportant. Moira Caldecott, a South African schoolgirl, had a similar experience when kneeling at the altar rail to take communion. As the bishop placed his hand on her head, I suddenly seemed to cease to be me. That is, in the sense of me, I had thought I was living in a particular house, in a particular street, going to a particular school. I felt that the most incredible flow of energy and power coursing through me, and what I had believed to be an experience of timeless reality, of consciousness that took in everything without limit, but reacted to nothing except in the sense of knowing and loving. In fact, it is very tempting to say that what mystical experiences all have in common is a sudden sense of one's real identity, and that this real self is in some sense godlike, could even be described as God. But perhaps the most remarkable of all accounts of mystical experience is to be found in P.D. Ouspensky's book, A New Model of the Universe, in a chapter called Experimental Mysticism. Ouspensky was the most important follower of the Russian philosopher and mystic G.I. Gurdjieff, but he was also a considerable thinker in his own right, as his books reveal. Ouspensky does not tell us the details of how he achieved his states of mystical consciousness, but his biographer James Webb is probably correct in assuming that he used yogic and magical methods combined with the use of some sort of drug, almost certainly nitrous oxide laughing gas. Ouspensky states that the change took place more quickly and easily than he had expected. The account that then follows is one of the most important and detailed in the whole literature of mysticism. The unknown, Ouspensky notes, is unlike anything that we can suppose about it. The complete unexpectedness of everything that is met within these experiences, from great to small, makes the description of them difficult. And he goes on to make an observation of central importance. First of all, everything is unified. Everything is linked together. Everything is explained by something else, and in turn explains another thing. There is nothing separate. That is, nothing that can be named or described separately. In order to describe the first impression, the first sensations, it is necessary to describe all at once. The new world with which one comes into contact has no sides, so that it's impossible to describe first one side and then the other. All of it is visible at every point. Here we have one of the most basic assertions that all descriptions of mystical experience have in common. Everything is seen to be connected, and the word seen deserves to be underlined. This world of infinite relationships in which everything is connected with everything else is seen all at once, from a bird's eye view, as it were, and language instantly becomes useless because it can only pin down one thing at a time. A man becomes lost amidst the infinite number of totally new impressions, for the expression of which he has neither words nor forms. What seems equally strange is that the normal sense of the distinction between objective and subjective disappeared. Here I saw that the objective and the subjective could change places. The one could become the other. It is very difficult to express this, The habitual mistrust of the subject disappeared. Every thought, every feeling, every image was immediately objectified in real substantial forms, which differed in no way from the forms of objective phenomena. And at the same time, objective phenomena somehow disappeared, lost all reality, appeared entirely subjective, fictitious, invented, having no real existence. And he goes on to say that this strange world resembled more than anything else a world of very complicated mathematical relations. This vision of infinite meaning made it very difficult to carry on a conversation, for between each word of the sentence so many ideas occurred that it was difficult to remember what he intended to say next. He began a sentence with the words, "I said yesterday," but could simply get no further. The word "I" raised hundreds of insights about the meaning of "I." The word "said" raised just as many ideas about speech and self-expression, each of which produced an explosion of thoughts, conjectures, comparisons, and associations. And the word "yesterday" led to endless thoughts and ideas about the nature of time, so that he was left with a feeling of breathlessness that made it impossible to continue. Something strange also happened to his sense of time, so that when his companion spoke, there seemed to be an immense gap between each of his words. When he had finished a short sentence, the meaning of which did not reach me at all, I felt I had lived through so much during that time that we should never be able to understand one another again, that I had gone too far from him. All this, says Ouspensky, was accompanied by immensely powerful emotional states. I took in everything through feeling and experienced emotions which never exist in life. His inner world became a kaleidoscope of joy, wonder, rapture, horror, continually changing, one into the other. The state seemed to allow access to infinite knowledge, but when he looked for the answer to any particular question, it began far away, and gradually widening included everything, so that finally the answer to the question included the answers to all possible questions. He encountered the same problem when he looked at physical objects. An ashtray seemed to arouse an infinite succession of meanings and associations, so that he scrawled on a slip of paper, "A man can go mad from one ashtray," and the ashtray, like everything else, seemed to be communicating with him, almost as if it had a voice. The remainder of Ouspensky description is too long and detailed to quote here, even in summary, although I shall have occasion to mention specific items elsewhere in this book. His experiments usually ended in sleep. With his awakening the next morning, a dreary and disappointing experience. The ordinary world seemed unutterably dull. This world contained something extraordinarily oppressive. It seemed incredibly empty, colorless, and lifeless. It was as though everything in it was wooden, as if it was an enormous wooden machine with creaking wooden wheels. Wooden thoughts, wooden moods, wooden sensations. Everything was terribly slow, scarcely moved, or moved with a melancholy, wooden creaking. Everything was dead, soulless, feelingless. They were terrible, these moments of awakening in an unreal world after a real one. In a dead world after a living in a limited world, cut into small pieces after an infinite and entire world. Page 50, Chapter 1. Next video will contain the remainder of page 50, Chapter 1.